A haunting cry pierced the stillness of the Tennessee forest, echoing between ancient oaks that had witnessed a century of secrets. The pregnant German shepherd thrashed desperately, her swollen belly heaving with each labored breath as the enormous snake tightened its coils around her body. Scales glistened in the dappled sunlight as the predator constricted with ancient patience, sensing victory with each weakening struggle of its prey. Deep in the woods, Thomas Whitaker's weathered hand froze mid-mouth above his morning coffee. His eyes, faded blue yet still sharp, narrowed at the sound. 5 years of solitude had attuned his ears to the language of the forest. This was no ordinary animal call. This was desperation. This was death approaching. Doc Whitaker set down his mug with deliberate calm, though his heart raced like it hadn't in years. He moved to the gun cabinet with the efficiency of a man who'd made life or death decisions before. The tranquilizer gun felt familiar in his arthritic hands. "Not today," he whispered to no one. "Not on my watch." The cry came again, weaker this time. Doc knew what that meant. Time was running out. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Dr. Thomas "Doc" Whitaker hadn't always been a hermit. 5 years ago he'd been a respected military veterinarian with a thriving practice back in Nashville after his service. At 72, his face now carried deep lines carved by both laughter and sorrow, with a thick white beard that hadn't seen proper grooming in months. His tall frame remained straight, a testament to military bearing that never quite left him, though arthritis had slowed his movements considerably. Doc's self-imposed exile began the night he lost everything. The house fire had claimed both Margaret, his wife of 45 years, and Russell, their faithful German shepherd. He had been working late at the clinic, an irony that haunted him daily. By the time he arrived home, flames had already consumed half the structure. The firefighters had to physically restrain him from rushing inside. The cabin deep in the Tennessee woods had been their weekend getaway, now transformed into his permanent refuge. He'd adapted it for year-round living, adding solar panels and reinforcing the structure against the harsh mountain winters. His days followed a simple routine, checking his small garden at dawn, maintaining the cabin, occasionally hunting and reading from his extensive collection of veterinary journals and classic literature by the fireplace at night. 20 miles away in Oak Ridge, most folks had stopped asking about that old vet who went strange. Few bothered to make the difficult journey to his door anymore, which suited Doc just fine. His only regular visitor was the monthly supply truck that left provisions at the end of his long, winding driveway. The German shepherd, now fighting for her life in the clearing, had a history of her own. Duchess was a purebred with an impressive lineage, formerly owned by Harold Matthews, a wealthy businessman from Knoxville. When Duchess unexpectedly became pregnant, Matthews had been furious. Prize dogs like her were meant to breed with selected partners, not whatever neighborhood canine had managed to jump his fence. 2 weeks ago, Matthews had driven Duchess deep into the forest, opened his car door, and simply driven away. The confused, pregnant dog had wandered these unfamiliar woods, instinct driving her to find shelter before her time came. Instead, she had found danger in the form of an unusually large black snake that had been terrorizing local farmers' livestock, a predator desperate enough to attempt taking down larger prey. Doc Whitaker moved through the woods with practiced stealth, his boots barely disturbing the carpet of pine needles beneath him. The morning had started like any other. Coffee at sunrise, checking his small garden for signs of deer intrusion, and planning to split more firewood before the afternoon heat set in. The animal cry that had interrupted his routine wasn't one he recognized immediately. It wasn't the familiar call of a fox or coyote, nor the startled bleat of a deer. This sound carried pure panic. A second cry guided him forward, weaker than the first. Doc picked up his pace, ignoring the protest from his right knee that had never fully recovered from an old military injury. He moved past the small creek that bordered his property into land that wasn't technically his, but that he considered under his protection nonetheless. The clearing appeared suddenly through the trees, sunlight streaming down to illuminate a scene straight from a nightmare. The German shepherd was on her side, her swollen belly exposed, legs kicking frantically as the massive snake tightened its coils around her midsection. Doc had seen many snakes in these woods over the years, but none approaching this size. This was the creature locals had been whispering about, the monster that had been taking down livestock at the Peterson farm 3 miles east. Doc raised his tranquilizer gun, then hesitated. The ethical dilemma hit him with unexpected force. His veterinarian's oath had always been to preserve life, all life. The snake was merely following its nature, hunting as it was born to do. If he killed it, he'd be disrupting the natural order. If he saved the dog but released the snake, it would only find another victim. If he tranquilized the snake, it would be vulnerable to predators while unconscious. Damn it all, he muttered, adjusting his aim. Nature's way or not, he couldn't stand by and watch the dog die, especially not with the unborn puppies inside her. The snake's head rose slightly, its attention divided between its struggling prey and the new presence at the edge of the clearing. Doc took a deep breath, steadied his hands, and squeezed the trigger. The dart struck true, embedding itself in the thickest part of the snake's body. The reptile's reaction was immediate. A violent thrash that momentarily tightened its grip on the shepherd, eliciting another pained yelp. Doc watched tensely, knowing the medication would take precious seconds to circulate through the snake's system. "Hold on, Garrow," he called softly to the dog, his voice rusty from disuse. "Just a little longer." Gradually the snake's movements slowed. Its powerful coils loosened fraction by fraction until the dog lay free but motionless on the ground. For a heart-stopping moment, Doc feared he'd been too late. Then he saw the shallow rise and fall of the dog's flank. He approached cautiously, keeping one eye on the sedated snake. Up close, the German shepherd was in even worse shape than he'd feared. Her coat was matted and dull, ribs visible despite her pregnancy, signs she'd been on her own for some time. Doc ran practiced hands over her body, checking for broken bones or internal injuries from the constriction. "You've had a rough go of it, haven't you, girl?" he murmured, noting the absence of a collar. He examined her distended belly carefully. The puppies were still moving, a good sign, but the mother was severely dehydrated and exhausted. She wouldn't have lasted much longer in the wild, snake attack or not. Decision made, Doc shrugged out of his jacket and gently wrapped it around the dog. She weighed less than she should, making it possible for him to lift her despite his aging back. As he straightened with his burden, the dog's eyes fluttered open, amber brown and filled with fear. "Easy now," he soothed. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog lacked the strength to resist as Doc carried her back through the woods toward his cabin. Behind them the snake lay in drugged immobility, its fate uncertain once the sedative wore off. The walk back seemed longer with the added weight, but Doc's determination never wavered. By the time the cabin came into view, sweat soaked his shirt despite the cool morning air. The dog had fallen into unconsciousness again, her breathing labored. Inside, Doc transformed his living room into an emergency clinic. Years of military field medicine had taught him to work with limited resources. He cleared off his coffee table, laid down clean towels, and gathered his medical supplies. Kept meticulously organized despite 5 years of disuse. "Never thought I'd be practicing again," he told the unconscious dog as he started an IV drip to combat her dehydration, "especially not on my coffee table." He worked methodically, cleaning her wounds, checking her vital signs, and using an old stethoscope to listen for the puppy's heartbeats. 4 distinct rhythms. She was carrying at least 4 lives inside her. Doc felt a responsibility settle onto his shoulders, heavier than the weight of the dog had been in his arms. "You picked the right woods to get lost in," he said, "though you could have done without meeting that snake." As evening approached, the dog's condition stabilized enough for Doc to move her to a more comfortable bed made of blankets near the fireplace. He sat in his rocking chair, watching her breathe, memories washing over him like the flickering firelight. Another German shepherd had slept in that exact spot years ago during weekend trips to the cabin. Russell had been a loyal companion through decades of military deployments and civilian life alike. Doc hadn't allowed himself to think about Russell much in the 5 years since the fire. The pain was still too raw. But something about this pregnant stray had breached walls he'd carefully constructed around those memories. "Margaret would have already named you," he told the sleeping dog. "She had a way of knowing what names fit." He paused, studying the dog's face, the distinctive markings around her eyes that gave her an aristocratic appearance despite her current condition. "Duchess," he decided finally. "You look like a duchess to me." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Doc added another log to the fire and settled in for a long night of monitoring his patient. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't alone in the cabin. For the first time in 5 years, he had a purpose beyond mere survival. 3 days after the rescue, Duchess was showing remarkable improvement. She ate the venison stew Doc prepared with surprising delicacy for a starving animal, and her eyes followed him around the cabin with growing trust rather than fear. The puncture wounds from the snake's fangs were healing without signs of infection, and the puppies continued to move actively within her swollen belly. Doc had just finished his morning check of her vital signs when the sky outside darkened prematurely. He stepped onto the porch, feeling the electric charge in the air that preceded a significant storm. The weather radio on his kitchen counter crackled with warnings of severe thunderstorms approaching the area, high winds, potential flooding the work. "Going to be a rough one, Duchess," he called back into the cabin. "Better secure everything while we can." Doc spent the next hour battening down the property, moving tools into the shed, securing loose items that might become projectiles in high winds, and checking that his emergency generator was fueled and ready. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as he completed the final preparations, driven sideways by gusts that bent the treetops. Inside, Duchess had grown restless, pacing despite her weakened condition, whining softly at the thunder that now rolled continuously overhead. "Not a fan of storms, I take it," Doc said, kneeling to stroke her head reassuringly. "Can't say I blame you." As darkness fell, the storm intensified. Rain hammered against the windows like thrown gravel, and the wind howled through the trees with banshee ferocity. Doc stoked the fire higher, knowing the electricity might fail at any moment. Duchess had finally settled on her blankets, though her ears remained alert, twitching at each thunderclap. The sudden frantic scratching at the door nearly stopped Doc's heart. His first thought was that a tree branch had broken free in the wind, but branches didn't scratch with such desperate rhythm. Duchess raised her head, a low growl building in her throat. "Easy, girl," Doc whispered, reaching for the shotgun he kept by the door. Not the tranquilizer this time. Whatever was outside, he wasn't taking chances with Duchess in her condition. The scratching came again, more insistent. Doc flicked on the porch light, half expecting it to be dead from the storm, but it illuminated the wooden deck outside. What he saw through the rain-streaked window froze him in place. The snake, the same massive creature he had tranquilized in the clearing, was on his porch, its body partially coiled, its head raised as if looking directly at the door. "Son of a bitch," Doc muttered, his finger tightening on the trigger. One shot would end the threat, permanently. But something held him back. The snake wasn't displaying aggressive behavior. It was pressed against the door as if seeking entry, or, more likely, seeking shelter from the deluge that was quickly turning the ground to mud. Even from inside, Doc could see the creature was injured. Fresh blood mingled with rainwater on its scales. Claw marks from some encounter in the woods. Doc's internal struggle played across his weathered face. The snake was the enemy, the predator that had nearly killed Duchess, but it was also a living creature seeking refuge from a storm that threatened to wash away everything in its path. The oath he'd taken as a young veterinarian decades ago echoed in his mind. Above all, do no harm. Duchess growled louder, struggling to her feet, sensing the proximity of her attacker. Doc gently pressed her back down. "Stay," he commanded firmly. Then, to himself more than the dog, "I must be losing my mind." He made a decision that went against every protective instinct. Moving quickly, he crossed to the back door that led to his attached woodshed. It was a simple structure with a sturdy door connecting it to the main cabin, a door that could be securely locked from inside the house. The shed had enough gaps in the walls to allow air circulation, but was otherwise weather-tight. Grabbing a heavy rain slicker from its hook, Doc ventured into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he rounded the cabin to the front porch. The snake recoiled at his appearance, clearly remembering their previous encounter. "Easy there," Doc said, though he knew the snake couldn't understand. "I'm not going to hurt you." "Not unless you make me." Using a long-handled garden tool from the porch, Doc carefully guided the injured reptile toward the open woodshed door. The snake seemed to understand the offer of shelter, slithering into the dry space with surprising speed. Once it was inside, Doc quickly shut the door and secured it with a heavy wooden bar. Back inside the cabin, soaked to the skin despite the rain gear, Doc found Duchess agitated and pacing, her nose pointed toward the connecting door to the woodshed. "I know, girl, I know," he soothed, kneeling beside her despite his aching joints. "Doesn't make sense to help the thing that tried to kill you, does it?" Duchess whined, pressing against his leg as another thunderclap shook the windows. "Guess we're both housing our demons tonight," Doc murmured, thinking of his own ghosts and regrets. "Sometimes that's braver than chasing them away." Throughout the night, as the storm raged outside, Doc sat vigil between two doors, the locked woodshed entrance on one side and Duchess's makeshift bed on the other. He dozed intermittently in his rocking chair, shotgun across his lap, ready for any sign that his unusual house guest might breach the barrier, but the door remained secure, and only the occasional soft thump from the woodshed indicated the snake's continued presence. By dawn, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a sodden landscape and scattered debris. Doc opened the cabin door to assess the damage, relieved to find his property largely intact. A few tree branches down, the garden partially flooded, but nothing catastrophic. The same couldn't be said for the surrounding forest. Whole trees had been uprooted in places, and the creek at the property's edge had swollen to 3 times its normal width. Had the snake not found shelter, it might well have been swept away in the deluge. As Doc prepared breakfast, oatmeal for himself, more venison broth for Duchess, he contemplated the strange twist of fate that had brought both predator and prey to his doorstep. In saving Duchess, he had set in motion a chain of events he could never have anticipated. Now he was harboring both a pregnant dog and the very creature that had tried to kill her. "Life doesn't get much stranger than this," he told Duchess, who had calmed considerably since the storm's passing, though she still kept her eyes fixed on the woodshed door. "I was supposed to be left alone up here. No complications, no responsibility." He glanced down at the German shepherd, seeing not just her but a shadow of Russell superimposed in his mind. The empty years stretched behind him, quiet and orderly and meaningless. "Maybe being alone isn't all it's cracked up to be," he admitted quietly. In the woodshed, the snake lay coiled among the firewood, its injuries exposed to the morning light filtering through the wall slats. It would need treatment if it was to survive, treatment that only Doc could provide. Another decision loomed, another step back toward the life he had abandoned 5 years ago. The following week brought a routine Doc hadn't experienced in years. Each morning began with checking Duchess's vital signs, followed by tending to the snake's injuries through the cautious opening of the woodshed door. He had fashioned a makeshift snake hook from an old golf club, allowing him to handle the reptile safely while applying antiseptic to its wounds. The snake, which Doc had reluctantly named Goliath, in his mind, seemed to recognize the routine and offered minimal resistance during these sessions. Duchess's pregnancy was progressing well. Her due date, by Doc's estimation, was still 3 to 4 weeks away. The dog's physical condition improved daily. Her coat regained its luster, and her eyes brightened with returning health. More surprising was the change in Doc himself. The purpose of caring for another living being had straightened his posture and put a spark back in his movements. He found himself talking more to Duchess, to himself, even occasionally to Goliath, filling the cabin with conversation for the first time in 5 years. "You know," he told Duchess one evening as they sat before the fire, his hand absently stroking her head, "Margaret always said animals saved more humans than humans saved animals." He smiled at the memory. "Looks like she was right again." As Duchess recovered, she began accompanying Doc on short walks around the property. Her pregnant belly limited their range, but the exercise was good for both of them. During these walks, Doc found himself pointing out landmarks and sharing stories as if Duchess could understand every word. "That oak there is older than this country," he explained, gesturing to a massive tree that dominated a small rise. "Margaret loved to sketch it in different seasons, said it had dignity." He paused, realizing he'd spoken Margaret's name twice in one day, after years of avoiding it entirely. On the 10th day after the rescue, Doc decided it was time to make his monthly supply run into Oak Ridge. The trip usually took most of a day, an hour's drive each way plus time for purchasing necessities. He'd never left an animal in his care alone for so long, but Duchess seemed stable enough, and he'd nearly exhausted his medical supplies treating both his patients. "You'll be all right for a few hours," he assured Duchess, filling her water bowl to the brim and leaving extra food within reach. The woodshed door remained securely barred. Goliath had shown signs of improved health, but was not yet ready for release. Doc's ancient pickup truck protested after weeks of sitting unused, but eventually sputtered to life. The rutted dirt road leading from his cabin to the main highway had been partially washed out by the storm, making for a teeth-rattling journey. By the time he reached Oak Ridge, his back ached and his mood had soured. Oak Ridge was barely large enough to qualify as a town, a handful of businesses clustered around a single traffic light, with homes scattered through the surrounding hills. Doc parked in front of Jenkins' General Store, the same place he'd been buying supplies for decades. The bell above the door announced his arrival with familiar clarity. Betty Jenkins, daughter of the original owner and now in her 60s herself, looked up from the register with undisguised surprise. "Thomas Whitaker!" she exclaimed. "Twice in 1 month. What's the occasion?" Doc managed a rusty smile. "Running low on a few things, Betty." "Must be important to bring you out again so soon," she remarked, watching curiously as Doc filled his basket with not just his usual staples, but also extra medical supplies, dog food, and several new blankets. "Got a patient," he admitted after her questioning gaze became too persistent to ignore. Betty's eyebrow shot up. "A patient? I thought you hung up your stethoscope years ago." "Not by choice," Doc said more sharply than he intended. Then, softening his tone, "German Shepherd, pregnant, found her in the woods." Betty smiled knowingly. "Always were a soft touch for animals in need, Doc." She began ringing up his purchases. "Speaking of medical matters, you still keeping up with your own checkups? Dr. Miller's been asking about you." Doc grunted non-committally. He hadn't seen a doctor since settling permanently at the cabin, despite occasional twinges and pains that had grown more frequent lately. "I mean it, Doc," Betty persisted. "Mike's concerned. Says a man your age should be getting regular checks, especially living alone out there." "I'm fine," Doc insisted, though even as he spoke a familiar pain flared in his side. a hot, sharp sensation that had been appearing with increasing regularity over the past few months. Betty looked unconvinced, but knew better than to push. As she handed him his change, she said casually, "Mike's office is just across the street, no appointment needed on Wednesdays. He always leaves a slot open for walk-ins." Doc pocketed the change, hesitating. The pain in his side had subsided to a dull throb, but its message was clear. Something wasn't right. With Duchess depending on him now, perhaps it was time to swallow his pride. "I'll think about it," he conceded. An hour later, Doc sat stiffly in an examination room, trying not to show his discomfort, as Dr. Michael Miller, a man 30 years his junior, who still called him "Sir" out of habit, pressed on his abdomen. "How long have you been experiencing this pain, Dr. Whitaker?" Miller asked, his expression carefully neutral. "Few months," Doc admitted. "Nothing serious." Miller's frown suggested otherwise. "I'd like to run some tests, blood work today, and I want you to come back next week for an ultrasound at the county hospital." "Can't do that," Doc said immediately. "Got an animal that needs looking after." Miller sat on his rolling stool, fixing Doc with the stern gaze of a physician who would not be dismissed. "Thomas," he said, dropping the formality, "this could be serious. The symptoms you're describing, combined with what I'm feeling here, we need to rule out several concerning possibilities." The drive back to the cabin was slower than usual, Doc's mind preoccupied with the vials of blood he'd left behind, and the appointment card reluctantly tucked into his wallet. The pain in his side seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, no longer content to be ignored. As he navigated the washed-out road to his property, Doc found himself cataloging the symptoms with clinical detachment. Pain in the upper right quadrant, occasional fever, fatigue he'd attributed to age, weight loss that had tightened his belt by 2 notches. The physician in him knew what these could indicate. The stubborn old man in him had refused to acknowledge the possibility. Duchess greeted him at the door with unrestrained enthusiasm, her tail wagging so hard her entire body shook with it. The simple joy of her welcome pushed aside his dark thoughts, at least temporarily. "Missed me, did you?" he asked, scratching behind her ears. "Everything quiet while I was gone?" A soft thump from the woodshed answered his question. Goliath was still present, still healing. 2 lives now depended on his care, and a third concern growing in his mind. The next morning Doc woke before dawn, with Margaret's voice echoing in his dreams. "Thomas," she had said, clear as day, "it's time to stop running." He lay in bed, watching the first gray light seep through the window, wondering if his subconscious was offering wisdom or if grief had finally caught up with him in the form of auditory hallucinations. After breakfast, he sat at his seldom-used desk and pulled out a notepad. With methodical precision, he began listing his assets, debts, none, and possessions. He drafted a simple will, leaving the cabin and property to the Humane Society, with the stipulation that the land remain undeveloped, a sanctuary for wildlife. It wasn't that he expected to die tomorrow, he told himself. It was just good planning, something he should have done years ago. The telephone installation crew arrived 3 days later. Another change Doc had resisted for years, but now seemed necessary. If his health was indeed failing, he needed a way to call for help. The technician, a young man with a patchy beard who introduced himself as Kyle, kept up a stream of cheerful chatter as he worked. "Not many folks choose to live this far out," Kyle remarked, stringing wire along the cabin's exterior. "Must be peaceful, though." "It is," Doc agreed, watching as Duchess observed the proceedings from a cautious distance. She had grown increasingly attached to him, but remained wary of strangers. "That your dog?" Kyle asked, noticing the direction of Doc's gaze. "Beautiful shepherd. Purebred?" "Just looking after her for a while," Doc said, unwilling to explain the complicated circumstances. Kyle nodded toward Duchess's swollen belly. "Expecting, huh? My sister breeds shepherds. It gets good money for the puppies, especially if they're pure." The comment lodged in Doc's mind long after Kyle had completed the installation and departed. He hadn't considered what would happen to Duchess and her puppies beyond their immediate needs. If he was indeed facing a serious diagnosis, he needed a longer-term plan. The blood test results came back the following week, delivered via the newly installed telephone. Dr. Miller's voice was carefully professional, but Doc could detect the gravity beneath his words. "We need to do that ultrasound as soon as possible, Thomas, and I'm referring you to an oncologist in Knoxville." The word hung in the air after Doc hung up. Oncologist. Cancer specialist. The pain in his side suddenly seemed to burn hotter, as if the mere acknowledgment had given it new power. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Duchess resting her head on his knee, Doc found himself speaking aloud the thoughts he'd been avoiding. "Looks like we're both on a clock, old girl," he said softly. "Yours is counting down to new life. Mine's—" He didn't finish the sentence. Duchess looked up at him with those amber eyes that seemed to understand more than was possible. She'd come to trust him completely in the weeks since her rescue, following him from room to room, sleeping beside his bed at night. The change in her was remarkable, from terrified, injured, wild thing to devoted companion. Doc wondered if she sensed the change in him as well, the growing acceptance of what lay ahead. He'd seen it countless times in his career. Animals who knew when their owners were ill, often before the humans themselves realized it. Duchess had taken to pressing her head against his right side, where the pain resided, as if trying to heal it through sheer force of will. "You're going to be fine," he assured her, stroking her head. "Those puppies are going to be healthy and strong." The question of what would happen to them afterward remained unspoken. A week before Duchess's estimated due date, Doc released Goliath back into the wild. The snake's wounds had healed cleanly, and it had regained its strength. Doc transported it in a secure container to a remote area several miles from his cabin, far from any farmland where it might prey on livestock. As he watched the massive snake disappear into the underbrush, Doc felt an unexpected sense of accomplishment. He had honored his veterinarian's oath, preserving life even when it would have been easier, perhaps more logical, to destroy the predator. "Go find yourself some nice fat rabbits," he called after the vanishing tail. "Stay away from dogs and farmers' chickens." Upon returning to the cabin, he found Duchess waiting anxiously at the door. She sniffed him thoroughly, detecting the snake's scent, but seemed to understand that Goliath was no longer a threat. That night she slept more soundly than she had since arriving at the cabin, her body curled protectively around her precious cargo. Doc sat beside her long after she fell asleep, his journal open on his lap. He had begun recording his observations of Duchess's pregnancy, along with memories of cases he had treated during his long career. The journal had become a way to pass on his knowledge, a legacy of sorts, though he wasn't sure who would ever read it. "We're quite the pair, aren't we?" he murmured to the sleeping dog. "Both starting new chapters when we least expected it." Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Inside, an old man contemplated the strange turns that had led him here, from respected veterinarian to recluse, to reluctant guardian of a pregnant dog that had stumbled into his life just when he needed a reason to keep going. Whatever time he had left, he resolved to make it count. The storm arrived with little warning, sweeping across the Tennessee mountains with primal fury. Lightning split the evening sky as Doc secured the cabin windows against the coming deluge. The barometer had been dropping steadily all day, and Duchess had grown increasingly restless, pacing the small cabin and whining softly. "Easy, girl," Doc soothed, watching her with growing concern. The German shepherd had been showing signs since morning. Nesting behavior, decreased appetite, occasional panting that had nothing to do with the heat. As an experienced veterinarian, Doc recognized the preliminaries of labor, though he estimated she was still hours away from active delivery. The timing couldn't have been worse. The weather radio crackled with warnings of flash floods and high winds. The access road would soon be impassable, and the phone line that had been installed merely 3 weeks ago had already gone dead. They were on their own. "You picked one hell of a night for this," Doc told Duchess as he arranged clean towels and blankets in the corner she had chosen as her nesting spot. His medical supplies were laid out with military precision on the kitchen table. Surgical scissors, iodine, gauze, suture materials, and the small pharmacy of medications he'd accumulated for just this scenario. Lightning illuminated the cabin in stark white flashes, followed by thunder that rattled the windows in their frames. Each thunderclap set Duchess trembling, her eyes wide with anxiety as she looked to Doc for reassurance. "We've weathered worse," he assured her, though in truth he was concerned. A difficult birth in these conditions, with no possibility of backup or emergency transport, could quickly become dire for both mother and puppies. At 9 o'clock, as rain hammered against the roof with percussion force, Duchess's water broke. She circled her nesting area 3 times before settling down, her breathing now coming in deliberate pants. Doc positioned himself nearby, close enough to intervene if needed, but giving her space to follow her instincts. "That's it," he encouraged quietly. "You know what to do. Been happening since the beginning of time." The first contraction visibly rippled across her abdomen at 9:17, noted precisely in the journal Doc kept at his side. He recorded each subsequent contraction, tracking their frequency and duration with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him a respected veterinarian in his former life. By 10 o'clock the contractions were coming every few minutes, but something was wrong. Duchess strained and pushed with increasing desperation, but no puppy appeared. Doc's professional concern deepened into alarm as he watched her struggle. "All right, girl," he said finally, moving closer. "Let's see what's happening." His examination confirmed his fears. The first puppy was malpositioned, blocking the birth canal. Without intervention, neither it nor its siblings would survive, and Duchess herself would be at risk of exhaustion and complications. Doc washed his hands thoroughly and reached for the surgical gloves he'd set aside. "I need to help you now," he told Duchess, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "This is going to be uncomfortable, but I need you to trust me." As if understanding the seriousness of his words, Duchess remained still while Doc carefully examined her. Decades of experience guided his fingers as he located the puppy's position and gently began to manipulate it toward the proper orientation. Outside, the storm reached new heights. A particularly violent gust of wind tore a branch from the old oak tree, sending it crashing onto the cabin roof with a sound like a gunshot. Duchess startled, nearly disrupting Doc's delicate work. "Steady," he murmured. "Almost there." The sound of vehicles approaching came as a shock over the storm's cacophony. Headlights swept across the cabin windows as several trucks pulled into the clearing. Doc's concentration broke momentarily. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not on a night like this. "Damn it all," he muttered, torn between the immediate emergency of Duchess's labor and whatever new complication had arrived at his door. Before he could decide on a course of action, heavy fists pounded on the cabin's entrance. "Dr. Whitaker," a man's voice called out. "Sheriff's Department." With Duchess whimpering in distress and a half-repositioned puppy between his hands, Doc had no choice but to respond. "Door's unlocked. I'm in the middle of something." The door swung open, admitting a blast of rain-laden wind and 3 men. Sheriff Jim Browning, his deputy Frank Wells, and a man Doc recognized as Bobby Miller, who owned the property bordering the national forest to the east. All 3 were soaked to the skin, their expressions a mixture of urgency and surprise at the scene before them. "Doc?" Sheriff Browning stepped forward, water pooling beneath his boots. "What's going on here?" "What does it look like?" Doc snapped, not taking his eyes off his patient. "I'm delivering puppies. Now either shut that door and keep quiet, or state your business and leave." The men exchanged glances before the sheriff firmly closed the door. "We're tracking a snake," he explained, lowering his voice. "Giant one that's been killing livestock. Miller here lost 2 goats last night. Tracks led this way before the rain hit." Doc's hand stilled momentarily. "Black rat snake? About 7 feet long?" Bobby Miller's eyes widened. "You've seen it?" "Better than that," Doc replied, returning his attention to Duchess as she gave another desperate push. "I treated it. Released it about 5 miles northwest of here a week ago, well away from any farms." The silence that followed was broken only by Duchess's labored breathing and the drumming of rain on the roof. Sheriff Browning was the first to speak. "You treated the snake?" "That's right." Doc felt the puppy finally shift into the correct position. "And if you want the full story, you'll have to wait. Right now, I need to focus." To his surprise, the sheriff nodded and gestured for his companions to take seats at the far end of the room. "We'll wait, but I'm mighty curious about this tale, Doc." With the immediate distraction handled, Doc returned his full attention to Duchess. "Now, girl, try again. Put." Duchess gathered herself and bore down with renewed effort. This time progress was visible. The first puppy's head appeared, followed by shoulders that had been the source of the obstruction. With careful assistance from Doc, the puppy finally emerged completely, a tiny wet bundle that Doc quickly cleared of membranes before placing it near Duchess's head. "Good girl," he praised as Duchess immediately began cleaning her firstborn, her instincts taking over. The puppy, a female with dark markings, responded to her mother's ministrations with a squeaky cry that filled the cabin. Doc's unexpected audience watched in respectful silence as the miracle of birth unfolded before them. The second puppy arrived 20 minutes later with less difficulty, another female, this one lighter in color than her sister. The third followed quickly, a robust male that emerged with little assistance needed. The fourth puppy, however, presented a new crisis. When it finally appeared, after considerable effort, it lay motionless, unresponsive to Duchess's frantic licking. "No, no," Doc muttered, gently taking the limp form. It was a male, smaller than his siblings, with distinctive markings that sent a jolt of recognition through Doc's heart. A perfect echo of Russell, the companion he had lost years ago. Without hesitation, Doc began neonatal resuscitation, his large hands incredibly gentle as they stimulated the tiny chest. He cleared the puppy's airways with a suction bulb and continued stimulation, all while maintaining a running monologue of encouragement. "Come on, little one. Your mama did all the hard work getting you here. Least you can do is breathe for her." His voice remained steady even as memories of Russell threatened to overwhelm him. "Not giving up on you that easy." Sheriff Browning and his companions leaned forward unconsciously, the snake hunt forgotten as they witnessed Doc's battle to save the fragile life. For 2 agonizing minutes there was no response. Then, just as Doc was beginning to lose hope, the tiniest of gasps, followed by a weak, mewling cry. "That's it!" Doc's face split into a grin that erased decades from his weathered features. "Good boy." He returned the revived puppy to Duchess, who sniffed it anxiously before beginning to clean it with particular attention. The puppy responded with strengthening cries, its little paws beginning to knead against her belly as it sought nourishment. Doc sat back on his heels, exhaustion hitting him suddenly. The adrenaline of the emergency faded, allowing the pain in his side to flare anew. He winced, pressing his hand against the spot almost unconsciously. "That was something, Doc," Sheriff Browning said quietly, breaking the spell of silence. "Never seen anything like it." Doc nodded acknowledgment, too tired for words as he watched Duchess tenderly arranging her 4 puppies at her swollen teats. The storm outside seemed to have eased somewhat, the thunder now distant, the rain gentled to a steady patter. "You okay?" the sheriff asked, noticing Doc's discomfort. "Fine," Doc answered automatically, though the pain was intensifying. "Just been a long night." Bobby Miller stepped forward, his previous anger about the snake seemingly forgotten. "Never thought I'd see the day Thomas Whitaker became a midwife to a stray dog," he said, but there was respect rather than mockery in his tone. "She's not a stray," Doc replied, surprising himself with the possessiveness in his voice. "She's mine." The declaration hung in the air, simple and profound. After 5 years of deliberate solitude, of pushing away connections and responsibilities, Doc had claimed a bond that couldn't be denied. As if to emphasize this newfound relationship, the smallest puppy, the one Doc had resuscitated, began making its way up Duchess's body, away from the warmth of its siblings. Despite its mother's gentle attempts to guide it back, the pup continued its determined journey until it reached Doc's hand, which rested on the blanket beside Duchess. There it nuzzled against his fingers and settled with a contented sigh. The cabin fell silent except for the soft sounds of the puppy's nursing and the steady rhythm of rain on the roof. Even the hardened sheriff seemed moved by the tableau before him. "Doc," he began carefully, "folks in town have been wondering about you for years. After what happened with Margaret—" He paused, gauging Doc's reaction to the mention of his late wife. When no objection came, he continued, "Some thought you'd just faded away up here. But that's not true, is it? You've still got that gift." Doc didn't respond immediately. His focus remained on the tiny life pressed against his hand, on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. Finally he looked up, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. "Sometimes the gift finds you," he said simply, "even when you're not looking for it." The conversation might have continued, but a shout from outside interrupted the moment. Deputy Wells, who had slipped out to check on the weather, burst back through the door. "Jim, we've got trouble," he announced urgently. "Creek's overflowed its banks. Road's completely washed out about a quarter-mile down. We're stuck here till morning at least." This news would normally have irritated Doc, who guarded his solitude jealously. Instead, he found himself nodding acceptance. "Plenty of coffee in the kitchen," he told the sheriff. "Could use some help keeping watch over the new mother through the night." Sheriff Browning smiled, understanding the olive branch being extended. "Happy to assist, Doc." As the men settled in for an unexpected vigil, Doc found himself telling the story of Duchess's rescue, of the snake's attack, and his decision to save both predator and prey. The tale unfolded naturally, filling the cabin with words after years of silence. He described the ethical dilemma he'd faced, his choice to tranquilize rather than kill, and the strange twist of fate that had brought the injured snake to his doorstep during the previous storm. His audience listened with rapt attention, particularly Bobby Miller, whose initial anger at Doc's treatment of the snake that had killed his livestock gradually transformed to grudging respect. "Never thought of it that way," Miller admitted when Doc explained the role of apex predators in maintaining the forest's balance. "Still don't want it eating my goats, though." "That's fair," Doc acknowledged. "I released it far from farm country, toward the deepest part of the national forest. If it stays there, everyone wins." As dawn approached, bringing with it clearing skies, Doc felt a curious peace settle over him. The pain in his side remained, a constant reminder of the battle to come, but it seemed less important now. Duchess slept with her puppies nestled securely against her, all 5 heartbeats strong and steady. The runt, the one Doc had brought back from the edge of death, remained closest to his hand, as if an invisible bond had formed in those critical moments of resuscitation. Sheriff Browning studied Doc with the careful assessment of a man used to reading people. "You know," he said casually, "my sister Sarah's a vet over in Maryville. Specializes in small animals now, but she started with livestock. Been looking for a place to set up a country practice." Doc raised an eyebrow, hearing the unspoken suggestion. "That so?" "Yep. Smart girl, dedicated, but could probably use some mentoring from someone with experience." The sheriff paused, letting the idea sink in. "Just a thought." Before Doc could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see a group of men approaching the cabin. Hunters by the look of their gear, led by a tall figure Doc didn't recognize. "Now what?" he muttered, the brief period of tranquility shattered. Deputy Wells peered through the glass. "That's Harold Matthews from Knoxville," he said with surprise. "Rich fellow, owns that development company, trying to buy up land around here." Doc frowned, the name niggling at something in his memory. "Matthews?" The deputy nodded. "Yeah, heard he was up this way for some hunting. Wonder what brings him to your door." The answer would come soon enough, bringing with it a storm more dangerous than any weather system, one that would threaten everything Doc had unexpectedly found himself fighting to protect. Harold Matthews strode into the cabin like a man accustomed to owning any space he entered. His hunting clothes were expensive and barely worn, his boots still shiny despite the mud outside. 5 men flanked him, similarly outfitted, but with the weathered faces of those who actually use such gear regularly. "Sheriff Browning," Matthews acknowledged with a curt nod before his gaze swept the cabin and landed on Duchess and her puppies. His eyes narrowed. "I see you've found my property." Doc stiffened, the pain in his side momentarily forgotten as understanding dawned. The connection he'd been unable to make clicked into place. Matthews was the man who had abandoned Duchess in the woods. "Your property?" Sheriff Browning asked, standing to face the newcomer. Matthews pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "German Shepherd, purebred, registered with the American Kennel Club. Disappeared from my estate 3 weeks ago." He extended the paper toward the sheriff. "That's the police report I filed. Theft of valuable property." Doc rose slowly to his feet, positioning himself between Matthews and Duchess. The dog had raised her head at the intrusion, her body curling protectively around her puppies, a low growl building in her throat. "Theft," Doc's voice was quiet but carried a dangerous edge. "Is that what you call it when a man drives his pregnant dog into the wilderness and leaves her to die?" Matthews's expression flickered momentarily before hardening. "I don't know what you're talking about, old man. My dog was stolen from my secured yard. Now I've found her, and I'll be taking her and those puppies back. They're worth considerable money." The cabin filled with tension so thick it seemed to displace the air. Sheriff Browning looked between the two men, then down at the document Matthews had provided. His face revealed nothing as he studied it. "This report says your dog went missing 3 weeks ago," he stated finally. "That's around when Doc here found this animal being attacked by a snake, nearly dead, pregnant, and abandoned." Matthews waved dismissively. "Whatever story he's concocted doesn't change the facts. That's my dog. Those are my puppies, and I'm leaving with them today." "Over my dead Maudie," Doc said, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. One of Matthews's companions leaned in, murmuring something in his ear. Matthews nodded, his expression calculating. "Sheriff, I'd like to file additional charges for theft of property. This man admits he's had my dog for weeks without attempting to find the rightful owner." "Now hold on," Bobby Miller began, but Matthews cut him off. "The law is clear. That animal and her offspring belong to me." Matthews took a step forward. "I'll be generous and not press charges if they're returned immediately." The small cabin had become a courtroom of sorts, with Sheriff Browning uncomfortably positioned as judge. He looked at Doc, whose face had gone pale with more than anger. "Doc," the sheriff prompted, "you all right?" Doc wasn't all right. The stress of the confrontation had awakened the beast in his side, sending waves of agony through his abdomen. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled to remain upright, to maintain his position as Duchess's protector. "You abandoned her?" Doc managed through gritted teeth. "Left her to die because she got pregnant by the wrong dog. And now you want her back because those puppies are worth money to you?" Matthews stepped closer, his artificial smile vanishing. "Careful with your accusations, Doctor. They could be considered slander." The room began to tilt in Doc's vision. The pain had become a fiery spear, driving deep into his gut. He was vaguely aware of Duchess's increasingly agitated growls, of the smallest puppy, Russell's doppelganger, squeaking in confusion at the tension surrounding its nest. "Doc!" Sheriff Browning's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You're white as a sheet." The last thing Doc saw before the darkness claimed him was Harold Matthews's face, not triumphant as expected, but startled, almost concerned. Then the floor rushed up to meet him and consciousness fled. He awoke to the steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell that could only belong to a hospital. Confusion gave way to memory in painful fragments. Duchess, the puppies, Matthews's arrival, and then nothing. "Welcome back," a familiar voice said. Dr. Michael Miller came into focus at Doc's bedside, chart in hand. "You gave everyone quite a scare." Doc tried to speak, found his throat too dry, and accepted the water Mike offered before trying again. "How long?" "3 days," Mike answered, his expression serious. "Emergency surgery. The tumor was larger than the scan suggested, and it had ruptured. Another few hours, and you might not have made it." The blunt assessment washed over Doc like cold water. "Duchess?" he asked, memories of the confrontation flooding back. "The puppies?" Mike's expression softened. "Sheriff Browning had them taken to the county animal shelter temporarily. Apparently there's some dispute over ownership." Panic surged through Doc, setting off one of the monitors. "Matthews can't have them. Easy," Mike interrupted, placing a restraining hand on Doc's shoulder. "Jim's looking into it. He's not convinced by Matthews's story. Something about the timing not adding up." Doc settled back against the pillows, exhaustion overwhelming his brief surge of energy. "How bad is it?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at his bandaged abdomen. "Don't sugarcoat it." Mike pulled up a chair, his face taking on the grave expression doctors reserve for difficult conversations. "The pathology confirmed what we suspected. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. We removed the primary tumor, but there are metastases to the liver and lymph nodes." He paused, measuring his next words carefully. "With aggressive treatment, chemo, radiation, we might be looking at 6 months. Without it, maybe 2 or 3. The news landed with the weight of inevitability. Doc had suspected as much from the moment the first sharp pain had pierced his side months ago. The physician in him had recognized the symptoms, even as the stubborn old man had denied them. 2 to 3 months, Doc repeated, testing the sentence like unfamiliar words in a foreign language. Mike nodded, compassion in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I wish I had better news." Doc turned his head to look out the window. The hospital was in Knoxville, judging by the city skyline visible in the distance. So far from his cabin, from the forest that had become his sanctuary, so far from Duchess and her puppies, who now faced an uncertain fate. "I need to get back," he said, the words sounding absurd even to his own ears. "Need to take care of him." Mike's expression made it clear what he thought of that idea. "You're not going anywhere for at least a week. After that, we need to discuss treatment options, living arrangements, hospice care." "No," the word emerged with unexpected strength. "No hospice, no hospitals. When I leave here, I'm going home." "Thomas, be reasonable. You'll need care, medications for pain." "I'll take the medications," Doc conceded. "But I'm spending whatever time I have left in my own home. That's non-negotiable, Mike." Before Dr. Miller could argue further, the door opened to admit Sheriff Jim Browning, looking uncomfortable in the hospital environment, his normally imposing figure diminished by the clinical setting. "Doc," he greeted, relief evident in his voice. "Good to see you awake." Doc attempted a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Jim, any news about Duchess?" The sheriff glanced at Dr. Miller, who nodded and excused himself, leaving the two men alone. Once the door closed, Jim pulled the chair closer to the bed. Matthews is pushing hard, he admitted. Got some fancy lawyer from Knoxville making threats. But here's the thing. That police report, something's off about it. Date's been altered. I've got Deputy Wells checking with the original precinct where it was filed. Hope flickered briefly in Doc's chest. He abandoned her, Jim. I'm sure of it. I believe you, the sheriff said simply. And I'm not the only one. Bobby Miller's been spreading the word about what happened at your cabin that night, about how you saved that runt puppy, about the snake you treated instead of killed. People are talking, Doc. They're remembering the man you used to be before... He trailed off, unwilling to mention Margaret's name. Before I ran away from everything, Doc finished for him. He sighed, feeling the weight of years of isolation. Fat lot of good it did me. Death found me anyway. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly. So it's true? What Miller said? Doc nodded once. Few months, at best. Jim absorbed this with the stoic acceptance of a man accustomed to bad news. All the more reason to make sure Duchess and those puppies end up where they belong, he said finally, with you for whatever time there is. The sentiment warmed Doc more than he would have expected, but reality remained cold and unyielding. Even if Matthews's claim is proven false, I can't keep them. Not now. Maybe not alone, Jim agreed. But no one said you had to do it alone. The county animal shelter was housed in a low brick building on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, a place Doc had donated to but never personally visited during his years of practice. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sheriff Browning led him down a corridor of chain-link kennels. Doc moved slowly, still recovering from surgery 2 weeks earlier, his body protesting every step despite the painkillers coursing through his system. She's been giving them fits, Jim explained as they walked. Won't let anyone near the puppies except Marla, the senior caretaker. Even growled at the vet they brought in to examine them. Doc nodded, unsurprised. She's protective. Been through hell. They rounded a corner to a larger enclosure at the end of the row. Inside, Duchess lay curled protectively around her 4 puppies, who had grown noticeably in the weeks since their birth. Their eyes were open now, tiny dark marbles taking in the world with newborn curiosity. "Duchess," Doc called softly. The German shepherd's head snapped up, ears forward. For a heartbeat she stared at Doc as if unable to believe her eyes. Then she was on her feet, tail wagging furiously, a high whine of recognition escaping her throat. "Hold on," Jim cautioned as Doc reached for the gate latch. "Let me make sure." But Doc had already opened the enclosure and stepped inside. Duchess bounded forward, her entire body vibrating with joy as she circled him, pressing against his legs, stretching up to lick his hands. There was no mistaking the recognition, the bond that had formed between them. "Hey, girl," Doc murmured, kneeling painfully to stroke her head. "Missed you, too." The puppies, disturbed by their mother's excitement, began squeaking and crawling toward the commotion. The smallest one, the runt Doc had resuscitated, made the most determined effort, wobbling on unsteady legs until it tumbled against Doc's shoe. Sheriff Browning watched from the doorway, a smile softening his usually stern face. "Guess that answers any questions about where she belongs." A throat cleared behind him. Marla, the shelter caretaker Jim had mentioned, stood there with a clipboard and a skeptical expression. "This is the man claiming ownership?" she asked, eyeing Doc's frail appearance doubtfully. "This is Dr. Thomas Whitaker," Jim said with enough emphasis on the title to make Marla blink in surprise. "Former head of veterinary services for the Army's K-9 units, and the man who delivered these puppies during a storm." Recognition dawned on Marla's face. "Dr. Whitaker, the one who used to run the clinic in Nashville?" When Doc nodded, she broke into a smile. "My father's hunting dog. You saved him after he was gored by a wild boar. Dad still talks about it." Doc carefully lowered himself to sit on the concrete floor, wincing slightly as the incision in his abdomen protested. Duchess immediately settled beside him, and the puppies, sensing their mother's comfort with this stranger, began crawling over his legs with increasing boldness. "How's the legal situation?" Doc asked Jim, even as he gently examined each puppy, checking their development with practiced hands. The sheriff exchanged a glance with Marla before answering. "That's actually why I brought you here today. There's been a development." Doc looked up sharply. "Matthews?" "Dropped his claim yesterday," Jim confirmed. "Suddenly and completely. His lawyer called the county attorney to say his client no longer wishes to pursue the matter." Doc's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Just like that? Why?" Jim's expression was difficult to read. "Let's just say certain information came to light that made pursuing the case inadvisable for Mr. Matthews." "What information?" Instead of answering directly, Jim pulled a folded newspaper from his jacket pocket and handed it to Doc. It was the Oak Ridge Observer, the small local weekly. The headline on the second page read, "Local Hero, Reclusive Vet Saves Abandoned Dog, Delivers Puppies During Storm." Below was a photo taken the night of the birth. Doc cradling the runt puppy just after resuscitating it, his face alight with a mixture of triumph and tenderness that made him almost unrecognizable to himself. The accompanying article, written by someone named Sarah Collins, detailed the rescue of Duchess from the snake, Doc's ethical treatment of both animals, and the dramatic delivery of the puppies during the storm. "Sarah Collins?" Doc looked up questioningly. "My sister," Jim confirmed. "The veterinarian I mentioned. She came to town for a visit right after you went into the hospital. Got talking to Bobby Miller at the diner and, well, she's always had a nose for a good story. Used to write for the Nashville paper before vet school." Doc continued reading. The article didn't name Matthews directly, but described a wealthy Knoxville developer who allegedly abandoned the pregnant dog in the forest when her unplanned pregnancy became inconvenient. It went on to mention that this same developer was currently seeking county approval for a controversial resort project. "The timing was unfortunate for Matthews," Jim explained with what might have been a hint of satisfaction. "County commissioners were voting on his development proposal the day after this hit doorsteps. Between this and what Deputy Wells found when he checked on that police report, which was, original date was a week after you found Duchess. Report was altered to make it look like she was stolen before she turned up in your woods." Jim shook his head. "Matthews withdrew both his claim and his development proposal within hours of each other." Doc absently stroked Duchess's head, processing this unexpected turn of events. "So she's free to go? The puppies too?" "They are legally considered abandoned property now," Marla interjected. "After a holding period, they'd normally go up for adoption." She hesitated, looking at Doc with sudden compassion. "Sheriff Browning explained your situation, Dr. Whitaker. Under the circumstances, we could expedite the process for you." The kindness in her voice made Doc's throat tighten unexpectedly. He looked down at the 4 puppies now sleeping in various positions across his legs, at Duchess leaning trustingly against his side. In the brief time they'd been separated, he'd missed them with an intensity that surprised him. "I appreciate that," he said finally, "but the truth is, I'm not in any position to care for them properly, not any more." The words cost him more than he wanted to admit. Jim stepped fully into the enclosure, crouching down despite the creaking protest of his knees. "That's actually the other thing we need to discuss," he said. "Sarah didn't just write that article. She's been asking questions about you all over town, your reputation, your practice before you left. Seems she's been looking for a mentor." Doc frowned, confused. "A mentor?" "Sarah's a good vet, but she's young, wants to open her own practice, but worried about taking on too much too soon." Jim's gaze was steady. "She's interested in your cabin property. Says it would be perfect for a combined small animal practice and wildlife rehabilitation center. Something about the location, the setup you already have. The suggestion hung in the air, its implications slowly unfolding in Doc's mind. She wants to buy me out? Now? Not exactly, Jim said carefully. She's proposing a partnership. You stay in your home, provide expertise and consultation as you're able. She handles the physical aspects of the practice, builds it gradually. When the time comes, he let the sentence trail off tactfully. When I'm gone, she takes over completely, Doc finished. The idea was both startling and oddly comforting, his home continuing as a place of healing, his knowledge not lost, his legacy extending beyond his rapidly approaching end. She'd like to meet with you, Jim added. No pressure, no commitments, just a conversation. Doc looked again at the puppies, at Duchess. The prospect of giving them up had been a weight on his heart during his hospital stay, but the prospect of having help, of keeping them with him during his remaining time while ensuring their future was secure, it seemed almost too perfect a solution. She'd better be good with German shepherds, he said finally. Jim smiled, recognizing the acceptance in Doc's tone. I think you'll find she's good with all kinds of creatures, including stubborn old vets. The meeting with Dr. Sarah Collins occurred the following day at Doc's cabin. She arrived promptly at 10, driving an aging Jeep loaded with veterinary supplies and a quiet confidence that belied her 32 years. Dark-haired and practical, with her brother's directness but a gentler approach, she won Doc's approval within minutes of beginning their conversation. I don't want to change what you've built here, she explained as they walked the property, Duchess trotting beside them. The isolation, the peace, that's part of what makes this place special. But with a few modest additions, we could serve the community while respecting the environment. Doc listened as she outlined her vision, a small examination room added to the existing structure, eventually a separate building for more extensive procedures, trails maintained for wildlife observation and rehabilitation releases. She spoke with passion but also pragmatism, acknowledging the challenges of a rural practice and the seasonal nature of the work. "And where would you live?" Doc asked. "Town's a fair drive, especially in winter." Sarah gestured toward the tree line. "There's a clearing about a quarter-mile that way that would be perfect for a small cabin. Nothing elaborate, just enough space for me and my books," she smiled. "I'm not much for crowds either." As they talked, Doc found himself impressed not just by her veterinary knowledge, but by her understanding of the community, the land, and the unique position his property held between wilderness and civilization. She asked intelligent questions about his experiences, took notes when he shared insights about local wildlife patterns, and showed particular interest in his treatment of the snake that had attacked Duchess. "That's exactly the kind of approach I admire," she said when he described his ethical dilemma. "Respecting all life, not just the convenient or cute species. It's what veterinary medicine should be about." By afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the puppies tumble in an enclosure Sarah had quickly constructed, Doc had made his decision. The arrangement made sense on every level, practical, financial, ethical. But more than that, it felt right. For the first time since receiving his diagnosis, he felt a sense of peace about the future. "There's one condition," he said as they finalized the details. "The runt, the one I resuscitated, he stays with me till the end." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. "Of course. And afterward?" Doc looked at the small puppy, now napping in a patch of sunlight. "Afterward, I think he might make an excellent therapy dog. There's a veterans center in Knoxville that could use someone with his fighting spirit." "A legacy," Sarah said softly. Doc smiled, feeling the weight of the word. "I suppose so." But neither of them could have anticipated just how that legacy would unfold, or the final confrontation that would test everything Doc believed about redemption and second chances. The last golden days of summer gave way to the fiery colors of autumn as Doc's partnership with Sarah Collins took shape, The small examination room she had proposed was quickly constructed, attached to the east side of the cabin, where morning light streamed through new windows. Local craftsmen, hearing through the Oak Ridge grapevine about Doc's comeback, volunteered labor in materials, transforming the space in a matter of weeks rather than months. During this time, Duchess's puppies flourished. The three females, now named Liberty, Hope, and Star by Sarah, grew strong and playful, their mother's protective instincts gradually allowing others to handle them. The runt male, whom Doc had named Russell after his long-ago companion, remained smaller than his sisters, but compensated with fierce determination and unusual intelligence. He rarely left Doc's side, seeming to sense when pain flared in his human's weakening body, and positioning himself where his warmth might provide comfort. "He's something special," Sarah remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills with fading light. Russell lay across Doc's feet, alert despite his relaxed posture. "I've never seen a dog so attuned to a person's needs, especially one so young." Doc nodded absently, stroking the puppy's head. "We saved each other, I suppose." He didn't elaborate, but Sarah understood. The purpose of caring for Russell had kept Doc going through difficult rounds of palliative treatments, giving him reason to push through days when pain would have otherwise confined him to bed. By October, word had spread about the new veterinary practice at Whitaker Woods. Sarah handled most of the cases, everything from routine vaccinations to emergency surgeries, but Doc consulted when his strength allowed, sharing decades of hard-earned wisdom with both Sarah and the steady stream of younger veterinarians who began making pilgrimages to meet the legendary Dr. Whitaker before he was gone. Throughout it all, Doc meticulously maintained his journals. What had begun as simple observations of Duchess's pregnancy had expanded into a comprehensive record of cases, techniques, and philosophical reflections on veterinary practice. When his hands became too unsteady for writing, he dictated to Sarah, who understood instinctively the importance of preserving his knowledge. "I've been thinking," Sarah said one crisp morning as they reviewed the previous day's cases. "These journals should be published, not just for veterinarians, but for everyone. There's wisdom here that transcends the technical aspects of medicine." Doc waved away the suggestion with characteristic modesty. "Just an old man's ramblings." "An old man who revolutionized field medicine for military working dogs," Sarah countered. "Who developed techniques still used today for treating wildlife injuries, who understood that all creatures deserve compassion, even those most fear." She tapped the leather-bound journal. "These aren't just ramblings, Thomas. They're your legacy." The use of his first name still surprised Doc, though he'd gradually grown accustomed to Sarah's gentle insistence on breaking down the formal barriers he'd maintained for decades. In many ways, she had become the daughter he and Margaret had never had, stubborn, brilliant, and unwilling to let him retreat into isolation even as his body failed him. As November deepened toward winter, Doc's condition deteriorated more rapidly than expected. The pain medications Dr. Miller prescribed grew stronger, sometimes leaving Doc confused or drowsy, but he refused hospice care or hospitalization. His home, with Duchess and Russell constant companions and Sarah managing his medical needs, remained his choice. "Doc," Sarah's voice pulled him from a light doze one afternoon. He opened his eyes to find her standing in the doorway of his bedroom, an unusual tension in her posture. "There's someone here to see you." Doc struggled to sit up, Russell immediately at his side for support. "Who?" "Harold Matthews." The name sent a surge of adrenaline through Doc's weakened system. "What does he want?" Sarah moved fully into the room. "He wouldn't say. Just that it's important and private." She hesitated. "I can send him away." Doc considered this for a long moment, then shook his head. "No." "I'll see him." "Are you sure that's wise?" The protectiveness in Sarah's voice warmed him. "Sarah, probably not," Doc admitted. "But I'm curious. Help me to the living room? I'd rather not receive visitors in bed like some Victorian invalid." With Sarah's assistance and Russell trotting anxiously at his heels, Doc made his way to his favorite armchair by the fireplace. He was shockingly thin now, his once robust frame shrunken within clothes that hung loosely, but he sat straight, determinedly maintaining whatever dignity his disease had left him. When Harold Matthews entered, he seemed diminished from the imposing figure who had burst into the cabin months earlier. His expensive clothes hung awkwardly on his frame, and deep lines had etched themselves around his eyes and mouth. He stood uncertainly in the doorway until Doc gestured to a chair opposite his own. Dr. Whitaker," Matthews began, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "I appreciate you seeing me." "Curiosity," Doc replied simply. "What brings you back to my home, Mr. Matthews? I thought our business was concluded." Matthews glanced at Sarah, who had positioned herself protectively near Doc's chair, then at Russell, who watched the visitor with unmistakable wariness. "I came to apologize," Matthews said finally, the words clearly difficult for him, "and to return something that belongs to you." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, which he placed on the small table between them. Doc made no move to take it, so Matthews continued. "It's the deed to this property. I purchased it last month when the county put it up for tax sale." Doc's eyebrows rose in surprise. While the partnership with Sarah had solved many problems, his financial situation had remained precarious. Medical bills had mounted, and in his illness he had neglected the property taxes. Sarah had offered to help, but pride had kept him from accepting. "Why would you do that?" Doc asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Matthews looked down at his hands, expensive watch glinting in the firelight. "Because I owed you a debt, one I couldn't repay any other way." A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Russell's soft breathing as he pressed against Doc's leg. "You were right about Duchess," Matthews continued when Doc didn't speak. "I abandoned her. She'd been bred by one of my neighbor's mutts, ruining my plans for a purebred litter I could sell." He glanced toward the corner where Duchess now lay watching him, her amber eyes unblinking. "I was angry. I drove her out here and left her. Told myself she'd survive, that someone would find her." "Or that she wouldn't," Doc said quietly. "And you wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience." Matthews nodded, accepting the accusation. "Then, when I heard about the puppies, about their value despite being mixed breed, I convinced myself I was entitled to them." He sighed heavily. "The truth is, I was never a good owner to Duchess. She was a status symbol, nothing more." "What changed?" Sarah asked, breaking her silence. Matthews looked up, something like shame crossing his features. "My daughter. She's 8. When the story broke about what I'd done, she heard it at school. Came home crying, asking how Daddy could leave a dog to die in the woods." He swallowed hard. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of in business, but seeing that look in my little girl's eyes—" "So this is image rehabilitation," Doc concluded, gesturing to the deed. "Buy back your reputation with a grand gesture." "No," Matthews said firmly. "It's an attempt to fix what can be fixed. I can't undo what I did to Duchess, can't change the fact that I tried to take her from the man who saved her, but I can make sure that you and Dr. Collins have secure ownership of this place." He hesitated. "My daughter asked me to make it right. This was the only way I knew how." Doc studied the man before him, seeing beyond the expensive clothes and privileged manner to something unexpectedly vulnerable. In his years of practice he had witnessed countless examples of cruelty and indifference toward animals. Rarely had he seen genuine remorse. "The deed is clear," Matthews added. "No restrictions, no fine print. The property belongs to you and Dr. Collins jointly, with full succession to her upon—" He trailed off tactfully. "Upon my death," Doc finished for him. "You can say it." I've made my peace with it." Matthews nodded once, then stood. "That's all I came to say, and to do. I won't take up more of your time." As he turned to leave, Doc called after him, "Matthews." When the man paused, Doc continued, "One of the puppies, the females, is being trained as a therapy dog for children. Sarah knows the program. Perhaps your daughter might like to be involved, to see some good coming from all this." Something like gratitude flickered across Matthews's face. "I'll ask her. Thank you." After he departed, Sarah examined the deed carefully. "It's legitimate," she confirmed, wonder in her voice. "He really did it." Doc nodded, suddenly exhausted by the encounter. People can surprise you. Even after 72 years on this earth, they can still surprise you. That night, as the first snow of winter dusted the mountains with silver, Doc sat at his desk completing a final entry in his journal. Russell dozed at his feet, while Duchess kept watch from her bed near the fire. Sarah had left for the evening, returning to the small cabin she had built on the property, leaving Doc to his thoughts. His hand trembled as he wrote the last lines. Life rarely gives us clean endings or perfect justice. More often it offers moments of grace in the midst of chaos. A dog rescued, a puppy revived, an enemy redeemed. I came to these woods to escape life. Instead, I found it again in its messiest, most beautiful form. Whatever lies beyond, I go there content. Life has a way of finding us, even when we try to hide from it. Dr. Thomas Whitaker's journey reminds us that it's never too late for a second chapter, even when we think our story has ended. After losing everything, he retreated from the world, believing isolation was his only refuge. But when a pregnant German shepherd crossed his path, something awakened in him, a reminder of the healer he once was, the man he still could be. Despite facing his own mortality, Doc found purpose again, mentoring a young veterinarian and nurturing new life into the world. His cabin, once a place of loneliness, transformed into a sanctuary of healing. Even in his final days, Doc discovered that what truly matters isn't how much time we have left, but how we use it. His legacy lives on not just in his medical knowledge, but in the connections he restored, with his community, with the animals he saved, and with his own heart. Remember, friends, our greatest contributions often come when we least expect them, and sometimes the most profound healing happens when we stop trying to heal ourselves and start healing others. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.